Hi, good evening, everyone, or good morning or good afternoon to whichever part of the world you are in. Welcome to all of you who have joined us here on the Zoom platform and Facebook and YouTube for joining us for this conversation. Just a brief introduction to the Urban Lens. This is the 7th edition of the Urban Lens Film Festival, and this year, due to COVID-19, we've had to go online. But every year at the festival, conversations with film practitioners has been a very integral part of the festival. And this year, we've decided to keep the conversations going. And today, we are going to be in conversation, or Nicole will be in conversation with Ruchika, Negi and Amit Mahanti. And it gives me great pleasure to be actually introducing Amit and Ruchika, whose work I have been familiar with for a really long time now, and who are peers in the community that we're all part of. And Nicole is someone whose work I've been reading for a while, and who's been writing on filmmakers, and especially Indian non-fiction filmmakers for a long time now. So it's a real pleasure to be introducing all of them today. I hope most of you have had the opportunity to watch the film, 2 Autumns in Wyszogród. If not, the film is on until 12 p.m. in the afternoon tomorrow. So I'm going to read out the synopsis of the film. An object buried underwater for more than 70 years resurfaces. Scraps of twisted metal, fragments left over from a war. What are the memories that come alive? What are the questions that revive? In 2015, the wreckage of a Soviet Red Army plane shot by the Nazis at the end of World War II was excavated from a tributary of the Vistula River, near the town of Wyszogród in Poland. The Soviet origin of the plane drew a lot of attention because of Poland's tenuous relationship with Russia and erstwhile USSR, and the continuing debate over its communist legacy. Was the wreckage a symbol of Poland's war-torn past that should be commemorated, or a bitter reminder of another nation's domination and control? What did the wreckage mean for Wyszogród, and why did it choose to house it? A town inundated with its own memories of war, an object mired in layers of contentious history. Over 2 Autumns in Wyszogród, the film tries to explore these frictions of history. While a group of students from the local school also search for answers, what does history mean to them? How do they look at their town's past? The film sifts through the residues of history and tries to glean the lessons it has left for us. I hope I did not mispronounce or kill the name of your film. I've tried level best not to. Director's bio. Ruchika Negi is a filmmaker and educator with an interest in critical and creative pedagogical practices. Her films include Every Time You Tell a Story, Malegaon Times, and ML056055. Try remembering the name of the film. She's been awarded artistic residencies at Khoj, New Delhi, Parco Arte Vivente Experimental Center for Contemporary Art, Turin, and Center for Contemporary Art, Ujazdowski, Warsaw, and is recipient of Charles Wallace India Short-Term Fellowship 2016. Ruchika was co-faculty at the Creative Documentary course, Sri Aurobindo Center for Arts and Communication in New Delhi from 2015 to 19, and occasionally teaches film at the Ashoka University in Sonipat. Currently, she's the associate editor at the Third Eye, a feminist learning platform supported by Nirantar Trust. The other director of the film is Amit Mahanti, who is a filmmaker, cinematographer, and editor based in New Delhi. An alumnus of AJ Kirwai Mass Communication Research Center, Jamia Millia Islamia, he has worked on films and video installations that explore questions of ecological transformation, culture, and politics. His films include Malegaon Times, Every Time You Tell a Story, Scratches on a Stone, which was awarded the runner-up prize at Film South Asia, Kathmandu in 2019. He has been selected for art and film residency programs at Khoth Studios, New Delhi, Parco Arte Vivente Experimental Center for Contemporary Art, Turin, Kran Film Brussels, and Ujazdowski Castle Center for Contemporary Art, Warsaw. Amit was also the recipient of Charles Wallace India Trust Short-Term Fellowship in 2016. Nicole Wolf, who will be in conversation with Amit and Ruchika today, is a senior lecturer in visual cultures at Goldsmiths, University of London. Her research, writing, pedagogical, and curatorial projects concentrate on political cinemas and alliances, the poetics of artistic and activist narratives, more recently connected to research on agricultural resistant practices and cinematics of the soil. Her participation in Living Archive works as contemporary artistic practice and archive both projects and archive resurfaces. Nicole, I think I've completely killed the pronunciation. I apologize. Both projects by Arsenal Institute for Film and Video Art Berlin include research and writing for restoration of feminist collective Yugantar 1980-83, their films, as well as development of the interdisciplinary urban permaculture design course, Soil City Solidarity, focusing on environmental justice. Recent publications are Is This Just a Story? Friendships and Fictions for Speculative Alliances, the Yugantar Film Collective in Mirat 7.2, Fugitive Remains, Soil, Celluloid, and Resistant Collectives with Sheikh, Sheila, Gray, and Ross. Thank you all for being part of this conversation today. And thank you so much, Nicole, for immediately agreeing and saying yes. Handing it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you, Subhashri, and for the whole team of Urban Lens. Like, I'm really, delighted and honored to be part of this. I've always wanted to come to the Urban Lens Festival, and it was just never possible because of logistics. So that's the kind of little advantage we have now with being online. That so that I could jump on the occasion and say yes to that. So I'm really super happy to be part of the festival. And very happy to be in conversation with Ruchika and Amit about their film. I've been following your work, and we've just also said that I've been hearing about the project at various stages. Like, we met when you were just finishing one of the residencies, and then I saw a rough cut and now the final version. So yes, I'm really delighted to be in conversation with you and looking forward to that next hour. So we have roughly an hour, I'm told. I will kick off with a few questions, but then towards the end we have time also for questions from the audience through the Q&A chat. So if people want to put their questions in the chat, and then I can read them out. And I will try to keep an eye also if there are questions which relate maybe directly to what Ruchika and Amit are talking about. Okay, so we'll start. Because we have time, I thought it'd be very interesting, specifically with your film, to go through the different steps of making the film, talking about your research process, the format that the research process has taken, which includes also a pedagogical practice, and maybe sort of talk about some principles of your research process and how you gathered the material. and then also to move to the process of working with the material that you gathered, and work that through, I find, a very careful scaffolding into the narrative of the film. Those maybe more practical sounding questions are of course not only practical, they're always ethical and political and aesthetic and technical at the same time. And to me also they already connect to your approach to history. And I found also now watching the film again that like I kind of propose that we maybe have a shared interest in thinking about history as not a fixed narrative, but rather a process rather than an event, and contested, multi-perspective, also battled, and taking shape through different means of communication. I'm here also thinking of your other film, actually, Every Time You Tell a Story. I was kind of reminded of that film. History linked to the question of legacy, of memory and trauma, things that are avoided and denied, and also very importantly, but maybe we can talk about that a bit later, what it means to do that kind of work now in this moment, and the challenges of looking at history, historicity, how we look at history in that current context. So I wanted to start asking you about your research process. You did a residency twice in Wyszogród, and I think what is very interesting in the film is that you, making a film, you're also encountering in the film different places where memory and history is created, like the museum, like memorials, certain landscapes, but you are also in a school and running workshops. So I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about how you approached that, whether the idea of the workshop was there right from the beginning, or it was something that made sense while you were there. So yeah, maybe we'll start with that.
So actually, firstly, thank you very much, Urban Lens, everybody, Shubha, everyone at the Urban Lens team. And thank you so much, Nicole. This is really a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Again, because we've often spoken about work in the past. So it's really nice. Thank you very much for making time. But coming to your question of, and I think in a way you kind of open I don't know if please join in. But I think in terms of research, this process is very interesting for us because, you know, often the thing is that before you start working on a film, you have a sort of, you've done extensive work in a way, and then one starts filming at a certain stage. But here, actually, the two were very interconnected because, like you said, this was a very different scenario. It was a residency. It was a 3-month in the beginning in 2016. So it was a residency for 3 months. And we sort of had an idea before we left that we were interested in this plane because we'd read about it. And to sort of, our beginning was actually the river, was the Vistula, because we'd been reading about all these objects of war that had emerged from the river because of the water levels going down. And one of the objects was this plane. And clearly because of the kind of histories attached to the plane and the kind of relationship between Russia and current Poland, this was something that really excited us, you know. But in a sense, I must confess the research sort of went along as we worked more and more. So we kept meeting more people, talking to them, shooting more, you know, meeting people in Wyszogród. And in a sense, the film kind of started shaping up from there. So it was a very simultaneous process, which in a sense was also new in that way for us as a method. Mahanti, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that, yeah, we were kind of interested in narratives of the river before we, you know, before we went for the residency, which, like Ruchika said, was for 3 months the first time around. We were kind of broadly kind of reading around the river because that's also something that kind of interests us. That's another kind of, you know, dimension of our work, which we also like to kind of engage, we have engaged with in the past. And this was actually quite serendipitous, just the story of this plane and how it was kind of unearthed, because it had just been unearthed a year before that. And it was interesting to see how much how much conversation that had suddenly created in Poland. So for us, then actually the entry point became two things. One was this idea of it being a Soviet symbol and what does it mean in current Poland. Two was the whole idea of this particular plane being a reminder of war. I mean, very specifically World War II. So actually both these were our kind of entry points. Like what does this mean today? What does the plane stand for when we start thinking about it today? And then after that, like Ruchika said, it was kind of a very intertwined kind of a research and filming process. So sometimes the act of filming was itself the act of research, so it was kind of moving in a very cyclical way. So that was what happened in the first year that we were there. And the engagement with the school actually came about very interestingly. I mean, in the sense that in the first year that we were there, we were kind of just interviewing different people. We were trying to meet different people in Wyszogród and trying to talk to them out. It's a very small town. It's like 3,000 people. So this was actually a very kind of the plane and the way it had been housed in this pavilion was a very central kind of a part of the town's current history. So we were just very curious to hear what happened last year when this plane was unearthed. What did you feel? So we're just kind of trying to gauge. That was our kind of first layer of engagement that we were trying to break down. And in that process, we met Grzegorz, who you see in the film. He's the teacher of history in the local school, and he again started opening up very interesting dimensions for us vis-a-vis this idea of war, etc. In the sense that I mean, I don't know. I mean, with Poland, we also know it has had this very kind of traumatic history. So sometimes kind of things are spoken about. Sometimes a lot of things are not kind of spoken about very willingly. But with Grzegorz and with the person whom we met in the museum, they were kind of very particular about the fact that history should be kind of laid out there on the table. We should not kind of conceal anything. And this was something that Grzegorz, the history teacher, would share a lot with his students. So that was something which kind of then led us to think about maybe another layer of engagement here, that that what we are trying to do, what if we try and do it in tandem with the students in the school and with the history teacher, and to see what can kind of emerge. So that was actually in the second phase, the second year that we were there. The physical engagement with the students was in 2017.
Yeah, thank you.
Just want to add one last thing to this, again, because you spoke about research. I think here what was interesting in hindsight, I feel, is also for us, is also that I think the interview became a method of doing research, in some ways. So this whole idea of conversations, so of course one is reading secondary material and one is doing all of that and talking to people and building one's own understanding. But the act of a conversation, I think became almost key for us. Which was also a new method of working for us, actually, because in our previous films, interviews is not something that usually we've entered a space or a context with. Usually our films have been very quiet, observing, that kind of stuff. So in a sense, I think because also it was a new context, one was very careful of not overimposing one's preconceived notions or, so in a sense, the idea of the spoken word or the conversation took precedence in that way and also shaped the film, which is why I think the structure is the way it is, perhaps. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Maybe we could stay with that a little, because I found that very interesting to observe in the film as well, is the way that conversations are staged. Is like you were also talking about the importance of the river. So it's also you're on the river, you're going to the river. You are having conversations in particular locations outside, or also in the museum next to the memorial. But also the workshops are a way of staging conversations, non-provoking conversations. I was also reminded of that, I mean, from kind of Champ Rouge, Chronicle of a Summer, this sort of screening of footage and watching footage together, which you see in the film as well. And so I found that, a very, very interesting to see, and interesting to hear you now speaking about those conversations then becoming research, and that not being divided between research and filmings. I don't know whether you want to elaborate a bit on the spaces that you were choosing, or whether that was also in a way something that came out for you in maybe being in a new place to go with people to a certain place, which one also knows from documentary practices, working with testimonies in the way that being at certain places also might then evoke a certain memory or a certain way of speaking, and also that you speak differently looking at something maybe together or walking rather than sitting on a table and speaking. No, it's a different way of having a conversation.
Yeah.
I don't know, actually in this context, it was actually the opposite which was happening, in the sense we were being taken to places, because, so that was actually again very interesting. So it was actually a very few of the conversations are places where we kind of actually pre-decided. Either it is just, okay, like for example, we are going to the library to meet the librarian and we just shoot a conversation there, or they take us, or like for example, in one of the early sequences in the film, you see the person who takes us on this kind of this barge, who takes us onto the river, which is how he wanted to kind of open it out for us. Just like, no, he said, this is what I want to do. Looking at, we were kind of just going with the flow of how things were actually happening in that moment, So like the museum director decides to just walk around the museum and show us different things. So we decided to go with that, So it was actually that kind of thing that was happening.
And I think what is also interesting, is like, and we've often discussed it actually, even while filming and of course while editing, the fact that one didn't understand all the time what was being said. So half the time actually, and we are really grateful for the translator who helped us, Carolina, who helped us with the translations in the film. But half the time actually, the things were being decided not by us at all, but things were just taking shape as one was there in the moment, right? And one was just continuously filming, hoping that there is something in this material and kind of trying to figure body language and posing questions to the translator accordingly. So it was a bit of a mix of many things and actually working very intuitively. Again with an interview, which is actually in a sense an opposite of an interview, because interviews are so well thought of. That's why they sit in and you frame a camera in a particular way. They're supposed to be the most non-spontaneous thing in a documentary, right? But here the opposite happened because of exactly language, being an outsider, somebody who was very new to the context. And I think at least for us, these are like huge takeaways in a sense. I mean, that was an interesting experience, at least, of working in this mode, So
yeah, that's very interesting too. How do you, if you don't understand the language, how do you present yourself, how are you situated in a place, and then sort of react more intuitively, also with using different senses, like you say, body language. Very interesting. And in relation to the workshops, how did that work? I mean, what's interesting is also the different generations that speak in the film, and also in the way that we do see snippages of what the students are coming up with. There's also sometimes a sense of, okay, there's something that we don't hear, may it be of language or which we'll also talk later about in the editing. So can you talk a little bit about how you set up the workshop? I know also, Ruchika, you're also teaching, so you're also interested in pedagogical practices, and so I wonder whether that came into your work as well there, and how that went. Again, also not speaking the language, and
So actually, I think so the workshop, like Amit said, came about in the second round of the residency, which was in 2017. And by 2017, the world had shifted quite a lot. Many things had happened, even back home, things that everybody was very concerned and worried about, right? In a certain way, things were shifting and moving in a particular direction. So one was constantly also asking oneself this whole idea of representation, the idea of authoritarian voice. What does it mean? What are the questions one can bring on? How to make one's own work more dynamic in that sense. These are always there at the back of one's head, but I think they got more foregrounded because the political climate that we saw, there was all around actually, including in India. But in 2017, actually, like Amit said, we were very taken in by Gregor, who was the school teacher, because, as a teacher, really, there's such amazing stuff, the way he was talking about history with the students. And our concern only was that we actually did not, so we were very keen to work with the students in some way. And since image is the only thing that we sort of know, that's our practice, that became the obvious choice. But I think the bigger question for us was that what are we going to work on? So will we tell them that, you tell us what you think about the plane, like the way we've been doing with adults in a way. And that seemed very pedantic because the plane was not their world, but the town, because, and I'm sure this is true of many European towns, but the layers of history in Wyszogród, the way that you see it, you could see that the kids, that history was a part of who they were, their present, but of course, from a very different perspective, right? So finally, like after a lot of conversation, we just decided that we are going to ask them a very simple question, which is that what does history mean for you in your town? And just as a way of sharing, we are going to start with this whole idea that when we look at your town, this is what history means for us, which was the plain. So that was why the whole idea of showing them the work, and just as a way of triggering off a conversation around ideas of history. And frankly, after that, because young people are so wonderful in these ways, they just took over in a sense. And it was a very short time that we spent with them. We were there for like 2-3 days.
But, I mean, there were kind of stages of workshops which we had.
Workshops.
So it started off with showing excerpts of the footage that we'd already shot to a larger group. And then the teachers themselves, they kind of streamlined the groups and divided them into smaller groups. And then they got them to work on their own ideas. And then there was a small group at the end, which actually went and shot stories of the town with iPads and Zoom recorders. So, I mean, very broad, very simply, that was kind of the workflow that we followed in the workshops. It was kind of spread over two weeks or so, but they were not long interactions, because also they had school and other school work to do, etc. So that was the kind of, the school would allot us a little bit of time to come and do in these workshops. So the final round of shooting that they did was done over a weekend, when they could kind of take out time and things like that. Yeah.
But I think what was exciting was also, again, talking about image and access and representation. The students could actually bring out aspects of the town, which of course we couldn't even think of accessing. So for instance, this whole Jewish narrative, I mean, of course, Amit and I were familiar and we were shooting in the cemetery, but there was no way that we could have gone and spoken about it, given our locus standi, given that it would, no matter how much you would read on it, you would still be voyeuristic about it. It is the Jewish question in Poland, which is very complicated, all of that. And they did it so effortlessly that actually then finally at the edit, the conversation became quite interesting to look at our material and to look at what they were, what the provocations their stuff was throwing up, actually then to the idea of history in a sense, of the same town. So I think so I think the workshop was was useful in this way as a learning for us as well. And they were of course very excited, which was very nice. so yeah.
Maybe that leads over quite well to talk a bit more about this step of the gathering of material, and then, because you've already hinted at, then you kind of look at the material and sometimes also you get something different from what you maybe expect that you have. And then what I said earlier, what is really wonderful in the film is that there's a real sense of a very careful scaffolding of different elements that come into when one is thinking history in that place, so there are kind of gestures into different directions. And of course there's a question of the sort of decisions on bringing out a complexity of a contested history and the kind of ascriptions of victim and perpetrators, and like what is spoken about, what is not spoken about. Like also in one of the sequences in the school, like one of the school kids seems to make a plea for, okay, we need to speak about certain things, and the teacher then sort of seems to be like, okay, there were differences in the group, but it's not really spoken concretely. And so this sort of relation between drawing out a complexity of history and how we write history, how history is narrated and constantly re-narrated as well, and how then a film also contributes to the narration of that history, and next to many other instances like the museum and the memorial and everything you talked about. So can you talk a little bit about that process of editing and how you devised the narrative, and what maybe were important principles for you there, or how that how you were shaping the narrative, also of course not working along characters. Also there is maybe a character, I'll come to that later. So if you can talk a little bit about that process, that'd be excellent.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of, again, this, I don't even know where to begin actually, because one feels like one has worked for so long on this film. It's hard to then talk about it like this. No, but I'm glad you asked this question. It's an often neglected question. No, I think for editing, when we were like looking at the material, one thing that we were very clear about is, of course, this whole thing that, I mean, so initially, actually, one had thought of also bringing in the river much more centrally, because we had also spoken to people who had who were involved with the river, with the digging out of these objects. And we had like lots of quite lovely footage actually with them. And so the idea, so it kept shifting that what would be the central character? Would the character be the river? Would the character be the plain? And actually the idea being that the star has to be history at the end of it through these, but what would be the medium to talk about it? So I think that was a bit of a struggle in the beginning. And then finally, for the sake of kind of tight storytelling and given where we were in terms of our expertise at that time, we felt that the plain actually sort of was the center stage, and also the town, therefore. So from the river, one shifted to the town in a sense, and also, also because of the children, the kind of provocations that they were throwing up with their material. So that sort of happened at some stage.
I think in a sense, all of these things are also kind of very
intertwining.
interconnected.
Yeah.
I mean, the plains history with the river and the plains history with other objects of war, the river's relation, the memory of the river itself that people had in the town. And, for example, in the museum, there are many images, like a lot of the battle, for example, had been fought across the river, opposing armies on both sides of the river. Then, of course, yes, the plain then becomes the kind of manifestation of that in very real terms. It was actually, when we were actually working with a lot of ideas at the beginning of the edit, and actually trying to figure out how best to kind of bring all of them together. So actually our previous cuts started with actually having many more kind of, many more layers and many more things, which we were then realizing is actually kind of obfuscating this overall reality that we're trying to represent of this place, So therefore, how does one talk about something which is so large in the past? How do we talk about in the present in a way in which it is meaningful, it is of value, right? So that kind of became a huge challenge for us while we were editing. But yeah, I think at some point this idea of when we moved through the river and the plain, and I think somewhere at some point this overall idea of this narration of history, what you're kind of saying, these different multiple narratives of history, that actually kind of became, I think, the kind of bedrock, over which everything else was kind of placed. And that also was something that we could also kind of relate to very directly in terms of what's happening around us today, how histories are being rewritten, manipulated, including in Poland. If we look at the way in which the communist history is today being rewritten in a certain way in the present. So there were actually all these kind of impulses which then kind of allowed us to maybe, I don't know whether eliminate would be the cut, to actually streamline the narrative. So actually the whole idea of history, and that's what the kids were also, the school children were also kind of, talking about very centrally. So I think finally at the end, that's how it kind of came together, even structurally in the film, that was the kind of impulse which tied up everything together. But at the same time, it is very hard to also ignore the complexity of the place in itself, right? I mean, the Soviet history, the Jewish history, the history of war, and so many other things. So which they were all a part of that, even the history of the present, the way in which it had to be represented. So yeah, it was a fight. The edit was a huge fight. Yeah. Trying to.
Yeah, I think what is interesting and what I find very successful in the film is precisely what you're saying, this relation between how much information do you also need to give to a viewer, and how do you still leave enough space for the viewer to navigate also with a certain freedom somehow in that. So like to leave a space to breathe and to think and that it's a certain subtraction is kind of a taking away is also needed for that, to leave them some space, and that was actually also included in what I wanted to ask you in terms of like what gets left out and the decision of where you also decide to stay with a gesture in a way, I mean you kind of responded to that already. I mean we had earlier also a conversation in relation to the rough cut, also in relation to that sort of material that is at the end, that's sort of really referring to the current sort of right-wing tendency and presence in Poland, and sort of decisions in how you treat that material, and there was also a question that I have in a way for myself, and also like, because you were earlier also saying that editing the film from the current political moment also then again changes the decisions that you make, and what needs to be there and what maybe needs to be taken away. So, and I think in the context that I'm in at the moment, this the question of how much to give a platform to certain representations, and how do we speak about it without giving it too much space. So I was wondering whether you wanted to elaborate a bit on this, like how you were thinking about that.
So actually, as you know, this was a huge dilemma, and you were referring to the right-wing march, which is there, right, in the film. So absolutely, I mean, and this was like a huge quandary for us, because I remember in one of our cuts, we'd actually begun the film with that. So, you know, the film sort of begins in the present moment, because that seemed the right thing at that point in time. But then again, precisely what you're saying, I mean, then one began to wonder, like, is one being a sensationalist in a way, right? And then sort of the juxtaposition of, see, this is bad and this is good, just became too almost banal, actually, in a way, to sort of use material in that way for us in our head. And so, so this whole idea of how much to represent and how to represent, I think with the right wing, it's absolutely clear that there was definitely a struggle, you know, as to how much to, when not to become, in a way, when not to become a kind of propagandist in another way, you know, to start raising a flag in a sense, so how not to do that in a way. But I think this is equally, with this film, it was equally true even with the Russian-Polish tension. I mean, in a sense, as outsiders for us, you know, and our constant parallel would be like if someone was making a film on India and looking at, say, India and Pakistan, would we be comfortable if we came with some wild political statements and, you know, took sides and said, oh, this one was right and this one was wrong? Because one hadn't done that kind of scholarship either, like that kind of study either. So that was another area that we were very conscious about in the edit, you know, to not sort of go overboard and to not take sides. But how do you actually tell facts for what they are, that this is what has happened, without, again, sounding either too informational or boring, but just to give a context to somebody who may not know this in a way, like the way like one didn't before one started working. You know, so I think that was another very tight trope for us.
Again, I mean, not to kind of also polarize the narrative from within, because I mean, I think that polarizing is what is kind of happening all around us, you know, and I think that polarizing is where the problem, is where the problem actually is, one of the areas where the problem lies. So I don't know. So maybe actually in the context of the right-wing march footage that we've used, it was, I mean, I think finally it came to that point where we were saying, okay, how can this inflect on what we have just experienced of Wyszogród, which is holding up a certain kind of definition or a representation of the present, of history, and what does this mean then in the context of that? You know, how would we read it? And we didn't want to kind of, you know, make you read it in a certain way. It is shocking footage. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, it is full-fledged propaganda. But the thing is that we didn't want you to only read that as propaganda. We wanted, I mean, that's the way in which, that's why it's probably been structured like that. The idea was to kind of see it inflected off Wyszogród. You know, what have we seen? What have we experienced? What can we learn from this place and the way in its relationship with history and with the past, and how it is kind of looking at its past. And then when we see something like this in the present, what does that make us think about? You know, so I guess that was somewhere the attempt. I don't know if that is kind of come through in the film, but the idea was not to polarize at any level to whichever extent possible, including, like Ruchika said, the Russia-Poland kind of history, because that's in any case a very, very complicated, complex history across centuries. I mean, that's so difficult to kind of just talk about in, you know, in one film, let's say, you know, it's so many things.
Yeah, there's so many aspects and interesting aspects in what you were both saying, and also something related to another question, and maybe the last question that I wanted to ask you, because I already see some questions in the chat, which is precisely to do with, and also because I think I know that you're interested in how you as filmmakers transform through these processes, and so how you are implicated in in your research and in developing a language, and how, I mean, you've just both talked about that sort of also changing through the process, and maybe also sharing then something with an audience of what you experienced in that place and the questions that threw up for you. So it's not something that's outside of you, but it's very much something that you have gone through, and that also then brings up questions of like, why and how do we look at history, and what does that mean for how we are accountable today in different places, and then also being, even if it's not a place where you have grown up, and which is, I think, for me actually something that is very refreshing. And also because of course I have profited from a tradition where, as a white person, the doors were open for me to come to India to do research. So so I'm also seeing that in like very refreshing and absolutely necessary to have that move, and appreciating that, so and now I lost my thread because I made a kind of go on with that. So I was interested in I was also interested in the elderly woman with a dog who ends the film and who keeps coming up as a character, but also in how you reflect on your own implication in the work, and how that plays out in different ways, but also how the filmmaking then becomes also a tool for a kind of, I mean, not to sound kind of too spiritual, but a sort of self-transformation somehow, no? Like it, and it's that it's not something that's outside of you. I don't know whether you want to say something about that. Maybe you could start with a woman and then.
It's really, I think everyone has asked us, whoever has seen the film so far, including some people who saw it yesterday on messages, it's been the question, what is the story of the old woman and the dog? So I don't know if you, I mean, just to very kind of literally explain the presence of the old woman and who she was, and for us and why we shot her so much. There's a reference which in one of the interviews which the museum director makes about this, a woman who goes and just, he has heard this story from somebody else in the town, that this woman just goes every day, takes a walk around that pavilion and actually says a prayer for the souls of the pilots. So actually, so we heard this story about her quite early on, and all through the our shoots, we really wanted to actually shoot with her, like, shoot a conversation with her. But it just so happened that, so we had several days which we went and shot, and some days we would go with interpreters and some days we would just go by ourselves. It would so happen that every day we would kind of bump into her, we would be without an interpreter. So we didn't know how to kind of even actually begin a conversation. So it just kind of became about this kind of a relationship that we ended up having with her. That we just be walking across the town and we just stumble into her. So after a while, we just decided that, okay, we are not being able to have this conversation, and for other logistical constraints, there was no way of accessing where she lived, etc. All of that was kind of also happening. So we then just kind of decided that, okay, we're just going to try and shoot her, and we're just going to try to shoot her in this particular way. Again, not knowing how she would kind of come into the film, but again, it was just a very intuitive thing. So whenever we would kind of see her, we would just kind of do it. And we had kind of figured out that she had a certain pattern. She would walk every day to the river with her dog, go walk around that pavilion, go and feed the ducks. That was the kind of her, we had seen her do that very often. So it just kind of became very interesting for us just to kind of shoot it like that, and just to see what it can kind of mean to us later. And frankly, that's the kind of shape that it actually took in the edit. I mean, at one level, at another level, if we are to kind of see what is she an embodiment of for us, she actually just represented the way in which, I don't know, I think, I don't know, you want to add to this, the way in which history, there was a certain kind of resolution of various kind of histories which we began to read through her, in terms of a relationship with the pavilion where the plane was kept, with the pilots whom she would kind of pray for. There was no kind of distinction. There was no kind of concept of, okay, no, those people are Russian, so I should not pray for them. So kind of, I don't know, this whole idea of humanism, which we had also, that was one lens through which the kind of town also grew on us, as we spent more and more time there. She kind of somehow became the embodiment of that for us. So therefore then, she just came into the film, so I don't know, it was just even we find it very hard to explain actually how she comes into the film. She just very, very instinctively has just come into the film and is a very strong presence for us, even though we don't hear her. But I think maybe it's just in looking at her actions and looking at her and just the way she is, that was probably what just kind of created a very strong connect and meaning for us. Yeah, but if you want
Ines, you've said everything actually. I just have like very simple things. Like, I don't know, when one looks at her, one just imagines that she's somebody given her age that who may have either witnessed the war or would have had something to do with the war. She seems that generation. And yet when you see her today, there is something so I think in a sense, she's the feeling of the film for me. She's the non-cerebral, she's the non-anything actually. She just is, and that is how she was even when we were around. And in a sense, there was also this, she was also not somebody who was unaware of our presence. So she would also sometimes, she would know that we are shooting and she would continue to perform her actions in a particular way. And I think that thing about her, otherwise one would also be perhaps a little wary of, putting in a stranger like this in a film. But despite not talking, one felt that there was a connection with her. I don't know how else to explain this. Like she had an awareness that she was being filmed. There was a relationship in some way through the camera with her, which was just became so much a part of her experience of Wyszogród. So I think that's a very long answer to a very simple question. Sorry. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, maybe we'll go to the questions in the chat because there are two already. So I will just read them out. So Anna Stratis is asking, how do you approach or prepare for conversations when there's such a contested history? How do you examine bias to be able to remain dispassionate?
This is a tough one. I think the thing, I don't know, I can't speak in a generic way, but I think like what was interesting, and because again, Anna, I think has also seen our earlier film, which is on Nagaland. I think what was interesting in this film was that, unlike when you're working in your own country or like in Nagaland, where one knows the political context and one has a position. So one has a position that, the state behaved in a particular way in the northeast of India or with Nagaland in particular. I think in Poland, one knew of what the contestations were, but like we said earlier, I think one was also trying to be as factual as possible. And the thing is, like, if one roots it through the way the right wing in Poland and actually all over the world, the way they've been trying to erase certain chapters of history and taint them to read a particular way, I think any person, who is slightly rational, you can see through that rewriting of history. So I think one went with that as a kind of as a mode of inquiry or a position in a way, without at the same time kind of saying that, Russians are, the Poles are absolutely correct and the Russians are always the perpetrators. So I think in a sense, it's a very tender game that it's a very tender sort of a balance that one has to do, I guess, in these situations and read the overall climate. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think again, in terms of when we were approaching the film also, so we went there actually with an open mind. It was again, like you said, it was not about whether a Russian symbol should be. We were no one to we couldn't make up our minds about it. Again, it was again in the process of actually working on the film that we, and probably through the 6 months that we spent there, maybe we were not even clear about what the answer was. Should the plane be there, given that it's a Soviet symbol on Polish soil? Again, we were not in a position to kind of judge that. So I think the idea while we were filming was to just kind of to respond to actually what we were hearing, in a way, to what were the different strands of opinions. Like for example, not everybody in Wyszogród is happy with that pavilion, that Soviet symbol pavilion kind of being there. They had their differences, but would still say that it's okay. But okay, it's there, but I don't look at it as something which is Soviet. I look at it as just it's a part of history, which actually would then become a very nice way of rationalizing the presence of something like that, which we then would take in as, okay, this is something that we are kind of understanding of what this symbol kind of means for the town. So again, there were no kind of preparations as such, or a bias already that one had when one was going and asking these questions or going and meeting different people. It was just trying to get a sense of what does it mean, and probably that is something that we worked on later while we were editing. We tried to tackle those questions in the process of editing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So a question from Ananya Revana is, the body of your film moves through various forms, from quiet poetics in framing the landscape to using phone cameras where the students are filming. How did you work with these diverse materials in your edit?
Again, I mean, not a very easy question to kind of answer directly how it all comes together. I mean, one doesn't really have a very, or one has a kind of logic and a rationale for weaving together different kinds of material in a film. But I think what was happening while we were shooting, like I think Ruchika mentioned at some point in the conversation, that we were trying to approach different situations intuitively. Again, like she said, we had no kind of baggage, preconceptions. There were different shooting strategies for different things that we were filming. So landscape has been shot in a certain way. Interviews just shaped on their own in a certain way, which were being directed more by the interviewees than by us. With the children and the footage that they shot on iPads. Again, that was actually a part of the plan, because we were thinking, well, what is a tool through which it can be that the children can shoot easily with. So and we knew that all of these were going to throw up different layers of narrative, I mean, in a way which would have to kind of come together. So yeah, well, I mean, in the editing process, well, it was actually, again, very intuitively, what was the logic of the edit, what was the logic of the storytelling, how was the story kind of unfolding itself, that just kind of, I mean, we weren't kind of consciously kind of thinking that, okay, this is a poetically framed landscape versus iPad footage of children. It was just kind of, how would it kind of, merge in together to create this overall sense of what we were trying to say. So I don't know.
Yeah.
So not,
yeah. I think
yeah.
Yeah.
So not really making having a hierarchy in terms of material in the first. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But of course, our relationship with different layers of material was different. I mean, which while we were shooting, so that of course.
Yeah. Okay, so another question from an anonymous attendee is, what was the response of the people from Poland who viewed the film? I'm not sure if they have they seen it or yeah.
Not in a public, not in a huge.
We haven't had a public screening. We've shared links with some individual people in Wyszogród, some in Warsaw. The overall sense of response, I don't know.
Very hard to sort of.
I mean, let me put it this way. Like, okay, so we showed it to Grzegorz, the history teacher, and he was kind of convinced by the way in which his town had been represented. So, which was actually quite a, we were feeling quite happy about that. There were other questions like, but why is your why is that right-wing footage there? What is the context of this footage in the context of this this place that you're trying to show? So, I mean, I don't know if there's been one uniform kind of response. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can't really remember.
Yeah, I mean, unanimously, I don't know if it's ever possible for a film, but I think like, I don't know. I think what was also interesting for us was this whole idea of working with children was something that a lot of educators there got excited about. So it was also nice for us in a way. I mean, actually, for one had never thought of it like that. But I think particularly because these were art educators who were also thinking of, how to make, I don't know, phones more meaningful for students or iPads more meaningful. One hadn't thought of it like that. But the idea of the workshop actually, and even Grzegorz and the school was very excited about it. So I think at that stage, working stages, it was really lovely to get responses and to have this kind of a relationship. But frankly, also, one hasn't had festival screenings in Poland. So what the film has only been seen within very safe circles, so to speak, as of now, friends and colleagues and, So I don't really know if that's an answer at all. But,
yeah. I mean, to me, it's also interesting to think through these different stages. Like earlier, you were talking about being rather led by people in the city because you didn't know the place somehow. So there's also, and talking about sort of intuitive responses. And to me, all of that also links to maybe not a decision about a specific sort of articulation of your political conviction, but it's about an ethical approach to a place and how you approach that. But then, of course, in the edit, you create your narrative, and then and you are then also accountable to yourself in a way, and that might not then be the narrative that every spectator would have chosen. So I can very well imagine that it's not an anonymous response to that. And but then maybe that relates to my earlier question in terms of your process and how you were implicated, and then that there's a kind of an open narrative, but there is nevertheless an accountability and a standpoint in the film. Like, mm-hmm.
It's like this editor friend, a Polish editor friend, told us that actually this is a film which ideally should be like any town. It's not like any Polish town, but finally what you should be left with, that this could be any town anywhere. And in a sense, I think that is the sort of an ethical frame of representation that one was working with, because it was like a story of a town which was so open and generous to looking at history for what it is, unlike what the rest of the world has become. So in a sense, if there is a moral of the story, and here there really was, but one didn't want to sort of, flag it out like a message, but that's the kind of feeling that one wanted to leave you with. And actually very deliberately, because this whole idea of history being the way it is for all of us, irrespective of where we come from. I think that in a sense was our political stand, if at all one could call it that. So just that.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so another question from Subhashim Goswami. I appreciate a material culture presentation of history, which is always alive and therefore significant and prescient. But what the film managed to do was tie in a material culture of history with its exact opposite, the intangible, unspoken, and the ephemeral that one cannot ever exhaust in terms of its meaning for people who live history in the present. That is a comment on the film. But one thing I missed is not getting a sense of the geography of the river, both Vistula and the tributary. Sorry, I forgot the name. I think before a river becomes a river of a place or a city river, it is always in a flow, both literally and metaphorically. I wonder if the filmmakers ever thought of this geography of a river beyond the place and left this story out consciously, or didn't think of it. But you were talking about the starting with the river, actually.
Actually, the starting point of the film was the river. I mean, we were actually interested in just that very basic question that, okay, when an object comes out of a river after 70 years, what are the different layers of different experience, including, for example, I mean, while we were shooting, we shot a lot with the archaeologists who had unearthed the river. We shot a lot with scientists who had been studying the flow of the river. And in fact, that was one of our very strong intentions. I mean, while we were shooting, it's only later while we were editing that the story kind of became something else. But that was actually a very huge kind of component of the shooting process. I mean, that we chatted with a guy who had actually dived down into the river looking for stuff, one of the underwater divers, when they were removing the objects from the river. So there were a lot of these conversations, and there were a lot of these dimensions of material which we have also collected. But yeah, again, I mean, the whole idea of the river not becoming a part, I mean, just that's how the river became a part of the story for us in the end. It became, again, like the kind of springboard through which we wanted to look at the present of this town, and hopefully through that extrapolate into something larger. So we were aware of it, we were conscious of it, but again, it's again in the editing process, it just kind of has been, just kept aside.
I mean, that also maybe half responds to the last question that I have here, which is about what you left out of the final film. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add, or
that's
primarily that. That was a huge narrative. Actually, the narrative of archaeology, the narrative of unearthing something, of giving it meaning in the present. How does an archaeologist, for example, look at this particular object which has come out, as opposed to, let's say, somebody who lives in Wyszogród, who will have a very different kind of a sense of memory or history that he associates with that. So yeah, there was all of that. And that was again a huge dimension of the film, of the footage which we did kind of that kind of answer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There are no more questions here from the audience at the moment. Is there anything that you feel like you would still like to share? I mean, I feel like you've shared a lot about your process and what's at stake also for you in terms of questions of representation and I don't know, maybe in how you were reflecting on that process in in hindsight, and because you were saying it was a bit of a different process maybe from other works before working in a different location.
I have a question actually.
Okay.
Perhaps.
Yes,
I'm going to take the privilege of asking. So, I mean, I am very familiar with Amit and Ruchika's work, and Amit and I have also collaborated on other work. So this is where my question comes from. So I was curious, and this is to do with my own interest in films, is I think what is really wonderful about the film is the fact that the Second World War, or Poland being annexed, or Germany's role in it's all history that even coming from the global South in South Asia, in our history textbooks, we read in a certain way, right? And there are lots of films made on it. You read a lot about it. But I think what's really interesting about this film is that through the testimonies of people, whether that's through their memory or the quiet presence of the old woman in the film, or actually the present itself, which is the students, there's a way that the idea of testimony making, whether through speech or perhaps otherwise presence, is actually adding to that grand narrative of history of the Second World War and what it may have happened. And for me, that is actually the most fascinating thing about this film, that 75, 80 years ago, something that happened, and whatever had to be represented on it had been, and yet something else that comes along and, chips away at that grand narrative of history writing, which I feel like is the role of testimony, of documentary film or art. But I was also wondering, Ruchika and Amit, because your practice is in diverse forms. You work with video, and whether that's a nonfiction film or you worked with video art projects and installation. And because memory is also an unstable thing, right? Whether that's about an event or a town and a place, different people will think of it differently. I was just wondering, were there other ways in which you perhaps thought of this material apart from a film? Was that ever part of your thinking? I'm curious. But yeah, that could be the last question.
Okay.
Well, I mean, to answer directly, no. I mean, it was always thought of as a film. There were points in time where we would have conversation with our curators to say that is there a possibility of kind of taking it into a different form? But again, I think that was something which we just kind of, along the line just decided that no, this has to kind of come together in the film, because also I think it becomes interesting to see these diverse narratives actually in the space of a single film. It's not kind of broken down into, let's say, a 3-screen installation. I think the whole dynamic of the narrative, the whole the complexities of that context, I think could only be represented through a film, which is seen from start to finish. So yeah, it was pretty much a film. I mean, to go back to something that you said earlier, yeah, I mean, this whole question of history over this larger World War history, yeah, we were completely overwhelmed with it the moment we landed there, and it was really funny, like the first few people whom we met, and you'd have long conversations with them, at some point or the other, the conversations would somehow kind of go to the question of war. With nothing, the conversation would have started with, what should we have for dinner today? And it would somehow kind of lead into this history of actual war. So that was actually something that we found very interesting to see, actually, how war is a very lived entity. I mean, the memory of war, even amongst people our generation, because of maybe the stories that they heard from the parents, grandparents, etc., is very, very real. So, so again, I mean, that was, it took us a while to kind of break down that, to understand how this idea of something as large as war can actually be looked at. So the way in which you said, Second World War, Poland, this whole history that is there with it. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, this is just my own journey. Because, I mean, the more I've been thinking about it, film also fixes things in a certain way, which is great. I mean, there's no issues. But I was wondering, given your own practice, that's why I was curious, because you've worked with different medias apart from film. That's why the curiosity.
I mean, now actually, like we said, with a lot of that material around archaeology, for example, which we shot, we've been wanting to think about it in a certain way and to see that can this same kind of meaning that we are trying to create, maybe it'll be something different, of course, but can it be kind of looked at through different registers? Again, maybe looking at something at the idea of the river, let's say, and see how the river itself is a receptacle of so many things, of so many different kinds of engagements, diverse kind of engagements, all looking at the same questions of history from very diverse viewpoints. So it's not something that we've very, consciously thought of, but again, these have just been running through our minds. So maybe work with the material at some point. I don't know.
All the very best. Looking forward to seeing that as well then. Cool.
Yes,
I think we've
like
run out of
Great.
out of time. Thank you so much, Nicole, for of course you watched many cuts of the film, but thank you for being generous even to Urban Lens and saying yes immediately. I mean, and I honestly mean it. We could not have thought of a better person to do this discussion. So thank you so much. And Amit and Ruchika, you've just finished the film. All the very best with it. I hope it travels in the world with lots of care and attention and love. Good luck with all the other screenings that is there. And thank you all who've joined us on Zoom, on Facebook, on YouTube. We hope to see you tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. The film that the film discussion that will be tomorrow is of a film called Eb Aleu, where the director Pratik Vats and the sound designer of the film Bignya Dahal will be in conversation with filmmaker Surbhi Sharma. So we hope to see you tomorrow evening. And as I said at the beginning of the conversation, this film, Two Autumns in Wyszogród, is available for viewing until 12 in the afternoon tomorrow, Indian Standard Time. I forgot to mention that. So thank you all. See you. Bye-bye. All the best.